Great. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the National Zoning Atlas's research brief presentation. Today, we're publicly launching our machine learning initiative, and we'll be walking through some of our progress in this direction and how this initiative can complement our current zoning code digitization efforts. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to put them in the Q&A section. We'll leave time in the end for questions. So let's begin. Diana, next slide. Great. So I'd like to introduce our speakers. My name is Wenfei Xu. I'm an assistant professor here at the Department of City and Regional Planning at Cornell and the research lead at the National Zoning Atlas. My own research looks at some of the causes and consequences of discriminatory housing practices in the US at a fine-grained scale using methods in urban data analytics and big data. Next, I'll pass it on to Sara to introduce herself.
Thanks, Wenfei. Sorry about that. I did not realize you were passing it over to me. Hi, everybody. I'm Sara Bronin, a professor at Cornell in the planning department, along with Wenfei, and I am the director and founder of the National Zoning Atlas.
Great. Thanks, Sara. And next, Judah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Judah Axelrod. I'm a senior data scientist at the Urban Institute. I'm based in both our data science team and our Office of Race and Equity Research. I'm going to be talking about Urban Institute's machine learning zoning pilot that kind of informs the larger initiative.
Great. Thank you, Judah. And Lydia, do you want to introduce yourself? Oh, Lydia, I think you're muted.
I am. My name is Lydia Lowe, and I'm a research associate at the Urban Institute's Metropolitan and Housing and Communities Policy Center. And I'm also the associate director of the Land Use Lab at Urban. My research focuses on land use, housing, racial equity, and systems change. And I'll be helping support Judah with questions on our part of the process, working on the machine learning initiative that we've got going here.
Great. Thanks so much, Lydia. And then finally, Sasha.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sasha Rush. I'm a professor at Cornell in computer science. I'm located at Cornell Tech in New York City.
Awesome. Next slide, please. So to start off our talk today, I'd like to take a step back and briefly overview how we read a zoning code. So zoning codes are delineated by both texts and maps, and the text portion of a zoning code is typically around 150 pages. Next, please. 150 pages. Next. Thanks. And so zoning is complicated. These texts have inconsistent terms. They're full of jargon. They're, as we saw, extremely long, hard to compare across different zoning codes. And this is partially because the zoning code process is very decentralized. Next, please. So because zoning is designated at the local municipal level, there are now estimated to be about 30,000 distinct zoning codes. And consequently, it's very difficult to know what all these zoning codes say. And so with that, I'll pass it to you, Sara.
Great. So with that background and this colossal amount of regulatory information out there, we have convened with a collaborative of researchers, the National Zoning Atlas Project, which aims to read all of these zoning codes and try to figure out what they say. The number of project teams has grown over time. So we started out in Connecticut. We now have 20 teams across different states, covering different portions of different states and digging manually into each zoning code. And these teams include institutions, about 36, maybe even more now, I think maybe over 40 now, institutions that have collaborated on these atlases. But to be honest, it's a really tedious process. There's no other way to describe it. I've done it in Connecticut. I know we have researchers all over the country who are doing it in their states. what we've tried to do is set out a standard methodology for Atlas teams to proceed with their data collection. So Dr. Xu told us that it was both text and map, and as a result, our teams are divided into both textual analysis and geospatial analysis. There's that how-to guide that you saw on the last slide that lays this all out. But reading through each zoning code is what we're going to be talking about today. So put the geospatial part aside, digitizing all of these maps. It's this zoning code analysis side that we're talking about today. And when we think about the zoning code side, there's a lot of different ways to slice it. We've sliced it as how we read zoning codes to catalog uses, how we read zoning codes to catalog lots, and how we read them to catalog structures. And within that, there's a lot of text about multifamily housing, accessory dwelling units, planned residential developments, minimum lot sizes, minimum parking requirements, the heights of buildings, how big they can be relative to the lot size or the FAR. And again, this takes a really long time to sift everything, to sift through all of these characteristics. So it's our view, way too long with many, many whys associated with that. So it's our view that machine learning can really accelerate this process. And there's a lot of reasons why, in general, zoning codes have machine learning potential, or at least we think they do. So for example, so when you think about how an algorithm might read a long text, as Dr. Xu said, on average 150 pages, it might be able to look for common words across these texts. And in zoning, you do see common words, setbacks, parking, lots, the three that we mentioned, but you can think of lots of others if you're familiar with zoning. We also know that zoning has answers. So if you're a property owner and you want to figure out if you can build a multifamily house on your lot, the zoning code is going to tell you yes or no. It's one or the other. The zoning code is going to tell you how many acres you need for your lot. There is an answer in zoning codes to the questions that we're asking in terms of regulation. And then finally, we think that zoning codes are a good candidate for machine learning just because there's an urgent need to understand them. So when we try to read lots of zoning codes at once, though, we see that there are issues that are presented. And so issues that a machine can better solve than a human, perhaps. And one of those is that complex text, long text, much longer than the texts that are typically used in natural language processing experiments so far. There's lots of cross-references. So you might know the name of the zoning district, but in order to figure out whether it permits 2 or 3 or 4 family, you might need to cross-reference the definition of multifamily, which is in a definition section. So there's a zoning code is complex in that different answers may be findable only by different data points on different pages. Then the issue that Urban Institute will discuss a little bit more, tables being hard to read. So we know that zoning might be a good candidate for machine learning. You know, it might present good, juicy issues. So it's not going to be just a run-of-the-mill machine learning problem. And then we come back around to the National Zoning Atlas, and where can we fill in those gaps? So we think that the National Zoning Atlas has pretty good data to feed into an algorithm. So we have so far a database of answers across 100 or more regulatory characteristics. So all those things that I showed you before, the questions that we're asking. Does this district allow lot size, lots of a certain size? Does it allow housing of a certain size? We have all the answers to that. So because of that, we have a good data set to train an algorithm to then read other codes and to see whether it can come up with the right answers. We also have lots of PDFs of zoning code texts, as well as PDFs of the maps, which have text on them as well. So in having that information in a uniform format, it again enables better processing and reading by an algorithm. And then finally, that guide, that How to Make a Zoning Atlas guide, which is downloadable on our website, is something that presents the vocabulary that an algorithm can use to try to at least think like a human. So, you know, that's our pitch, or at least my pitch, for thinking that the National Zoning Atlas is a good candidate for machine learning. And with that basic summary that builds on Dr. Xu's introduction, I'm going to turn it over to our colleagues at the Urban Institute, and I believe Judah is going to take over from here.
Great, thanks so much, Sarah. Yep, so as Sarah mentioned, I'm going to walk through kind of Urban's zoning data collection pilot. Wenfei and Sara kind of already motivated what the objective here was, which is to test how feasible it is to automate some or all of this very onerous manual data collection process. And so Urban's approach, just in this small pilot, was to attempt to collect just one piece of information out of the dozens of pieces of information that Sarah mentioned before that is contained in the National Zoning Atlas data using text analysis and machine learning. And that piece of information, which I'll mention again later, was the type of zoning district, so either primarily residential, mixed with residential, or non-residential. Our methodology, I'll provide a kind of on the next slide of better visualization, but there are kind of 5 main steps to the methodology, the first of which was collecting all of the zoning documents that we needed, which thankfully the Zoning Atlas team had already kind of done much of that work for us. Next was to kind of prep the codes for analysis by extracting text from them. And so we used what's called optical character recognition software, the same technology that if you kind of right-click on a PDF file, you can convert it from an image to something that has searchable text. And so this allowed us to extract the text from all these unstandardized zoning documents and PDFs. The third step was to identify all of the zoning districts, which might seem easy, but there really isn't a comprehensive list of what constitutes a zoning district or a list of zoning districts at the state or national level. And so that was a step we had to go through. Once we had identified all the zoning districts, we needed to assemble relevant text that corresponded to each zoning district. And then finally, that text fed into a machine learning model, which we used to kind of predict the type of zoning district, as I mentioned before. And that relied on having access to, as Sarah mentioned, a training data set which already had those kind of ground truth answers. And I'll say, I think a couple things worth pointing out here. What we did to identify the zoning districts also relied on this kind of human review process. We were able to kind of algorithmically identify roughly 55 to 60% of all the zoning districts in Connecticut, which is our geographic scope. But of course, that's not really a kind of a practical level of accuracy. And so we had a human review process to kind of compare zoning district names that were identified by the algorithm and supplement them with whatever was missing or whatever shouldn't have been there. Then, at the machine learning stage, we were able to kind of build a model that was about 75% accurate at just this one very particular question. It's clear to us that the model was learning something from the data. It was doing better than just kind of random chance and then kind of some very rough baseline models. But again, we would be hoping that a human research team could do a lot better than 75% at this question and at other questions. So I think our conclusion was, this isn't quite ready for prime time. So to that point, some kind of automation challenges and logical extensions here. I think one big challenge we encountered was that a lot of the data that we're looking for, that would be able to answer some of these important questions pertaining to a given zoning district was presented in tabular form. So in these permitted use tables, for instance, somewhere within a zoning document. And this was just something that our machine learning approach kind of couldn't really handle, and something that probably, deep learning model or a large language model could handle a lot better. And so I think any approach that wants to kind of extend on what we did should probably start there. And luckily, it seems like that's exactly what's happening. Another issue is kind of, I had mentioned we had access to this ground truth data in Connecticut, and that was how we were able to test how accurately we were identifying zoning district names and how accurately our machine learning model was performing. But of course, in practice, the idea is that this would be an alternative to manual data collection. And so in the absence of ground truth data, say in other states, there often isn't a way to know exactly, how well a model or an automated approach is doing. And so, I think it's important to have kind of human guardrails at those steps to be able to jump in and do what a model can't at that stage. And then finally, just as has been mentioned before, zoning documents are incredibly nuanced, complex, extremely unstandardized. And I think we found that this, posed a very severe complication to our own analysis. So I think the heavy lift recommendation of kind of a machine learning extension, I'll leave to the Cornell folks to talk about. I think they have done some great work, and we're excited to see that they're kind of building on what we only started to do. But I think the light lift extension, which is on this slide, is something that we envision could be really effective is a hybrid process. So Sara mentioned the how-to guide. We're envisioning something like a hybrid how-to guide where we're not replacing the human effort and expertise in assembling and compiling this data, but we're kind of supporting it with the things that algorithms and computers can do really well. And so one potential hybrid process, which we've outlined in a paper that we've released, could look something like this. To collect the zoning documents that you need, could make use of a mixture of web scraping techniques to gather the documents from municipal websites and other sites like Municode or Ecode 360, using the OCR software to extract the text from those documents and make them analyzable. Then, similarly to what we did, could have an algorithm try to identify the zoning districts, but then a kind of a heavy human review at that step to kind of lessen the amount of work that they have to do, but not replace it. Third, flagging the text that's relevant to each zoning district that could have the information that we're looking for to feed into a model. So again, instead of having a human kind of do that totally from scratch, the idea would be to have an algorithm flag locations in a zoning code where that information is likelier to be located. And then this could reduce the amount of time necessary for a human reviewer. And then finally, something that we understand is already happening is kind of an automated data validation system to ensure that the data being entered for a given zoning district follows certain logical rules. And of course, any efforts to kind of standardize zoning data at state or federal level would be very welcome. But in the absence of that, I think I'll pass it over to Sasha to talk about the kind of more extended version of the machine learning approach that we begun to do here.
Thanks, Judah. I came to this project about 3 or 4 months ago, and I've mostly been working with a team of students here at Cornell Tech. I want to give a shout out to them, Isha Khanna and Max Dumas, and also a grad student in my lab, Justin Xu. We hadn't really ever, at least me and my grad students hadn't really ever seen a zoning code before, and I think we were amazed at both the complexity and the kind of logical structure of how they worked, how kind of all these documents have this kind of latent logical form to them, but we're all expressing them in extremely different ways. So starting with that, let me just extend on what Judah said and talk about a little bit of the challenge here on the next slide. Cool. So yeah, so just to give you a sense, we're machine learning researchers. We work particularly on natural language processing. We haven't really worked on problems like this before, but we're kind of trying to bring some of the state-of-the-art approaches in the field to this problem itself. Next slide. Cool. So the main way we're going to kind of take on this challenge is we'd like to build a system that is actually less complex in the sense that it really only has 2 stages. We're going to try to map from zoning codes to a kind of raw textual representation. As was noted before, these documents can be quite long. And so we're talking about kind of just a massive text file with all the kind of information in the zoning code itself. From that, we're going to try to just directly convert it into structured data, where the structured data roughly takes on the schema that Sara and her team laid out. So as I mentioned earlier, there are 3 really kind of key challenges here. As Sara mentioned, these documents are extremely long. It's way longer than anything I've worked with in the past. We're trying to do extraction from hundreds of pages. And kind of knowing where the information is within the documents is a challenge in itself. The next challenge is if you've looked at these documents, you'll kind of quickly realize how non-standardized they are. And they're non-standardized in a tricky way in that sometimes each chapter will be about a given district, but sometimes district information will be spread across multiple chapters, and each chapter will be about either height restrictions or other properties, and things will get tied together or kind of commingled in different manners. And you really need to read at least a paragraph of the text to understand kind of what is being implied. Finally, the last challenge is there's a lot of missing or implied information that is domain specific. It's not actually written in the zoning documents itself. It's something that you have to just know about in the field. And honestly, as a non-expert coming in, the difference between, say, min parcel size and min unit size and min lot size, like those all seemed roughly like synonyms, or sometimes they're antonyms. But I think A lot of that information is not in the documents itself, but it's in the information that experts have put together, kind of external to the document. Cool. So given this, our kind of our initial assumption is that a lot of the kind of standard methods for NLP extraction would maybe not apply here, or kind of run into some of the challenges that Judah mentioned before. So in particular, the typical setting that we mostly see in natural language processing is supervision that looks very similar to the sort of documents that we're going to receive down the line. So you might see 100 documents of the same type and then try to make a prediction on the 100th and 1st. What we noticed here, though, was that we might see 100 zoning codes, and the 101st zoning code might actually lay out the information in a completely unique and different way. Traditional methods also struggle a lot with some of the reasoning that needs to be applied in order to understand some of these codes. So for instance, a system that doesn't look at the text surrounding a code might struggle with complex language such as negation and give back exactly the wrong result. Cool. So luckily, the last couple years have seen a real kind of revolution in the field of natural language processing. We've seen a kind of developments of general purpose systems known as large language models, which have this really kind of remarkable property that they're relatively good across tasks that they've never seen before. So while they might not be good at kind of traditional NLP tasks, they are particularly applicable to cases like this, where new text might come up that you need to understand that you haven't ever kind of seen a version before. And roughly in our field, we refer to this as kind of zero-shot prediction. And this has kind of been developing in the field for the last 3 years, but recently in the last, I'd say 3 months or so, it's been extremely popularized in the popular press under the brand name ChatGPT, and just as of yesterday, GPT-4. So let me talk a little bit about how we can use these sort of models for the zoning problem. So we're going to start with a scanned PDF. This is a real picture of a PDF from a zoning code. This is just a scan, so we don't have the raw information. We have to just rely on the location of information on this page in order to make the prediction we might want to make. In particular, we're going to focus on district R30 and understanding what the lot minimum size would be. So when we scan this, we get something like the following. OCR methods have really advanced a lot in the last couple of years, and they can do things like tables and structured data quite well. However, when we convert this to text, we get this kind of weird format. We lose the kind of visual representation, and we just get kind of this raw TXT file that shows the cell numbers by rows and columns. We have to be able to read that and extract out the information that's useful for this task. What we do is, as the next step, is to take the raw text file for all 150 pages, and we run what would basically be a kind of old-fashioned search engine over the text data itself. We take the search terms defined in the zoning atlas, and we build a thesaurus. I think this thesaurus is already pretty complete, but I think any more information we add to it, or structured information we give for different synonyms or different ways words are referred to, can all be kind of put into the system to improve it. From this search engine, what we're looking for is a 5-page snippet that we roughly think will have all of the information that will underlie the prediction we're trying to make. Once we find that snippet, what we do is actually quite naive. We take the snippet and we feed it to a model like ChatGPT. The model can do the following. We ask it a question like, pretend you are a lawyer, extract the information that corresponds to the minimum lot size of a district. Minimum lot size is also known as minimum parcel size. Express this information in a tabular form. This feels like quite a strange way of going about this problem, but what's remarkable is that it's a way to kind of give the instructions that you might give in one of these extraction problems to the system with all the domain knowledge that people have accumulated in the field. And what happens is when you do this, you actually get out pretty surprisingly good results. So just as an example, if we say the following, the one I just gave, pretend you are reading a law document, find all the occurrences that specify what the minimum lot size is for the R160 district of Bethany in the following text, output the size and the reasoning. What you'll get is a textual output that will tell you the minimum lot size for R130, and it will tell you the cell. This is just from the text that you fed into the system. You can then take this information and overlay it over the original zoning code. So if you go to the next slide. So from this, the text we had, we can then go back to the original and kind of point out where the model was looking when it made this prediction. We hope we can build this in either as a way to have human confirmation or as part of the labeling procedure to quickly find and help human labelers go through and find all these properties in the zoning codes. Cool. And we're hoping to build a tool to make this easy to go through, to look at what comes out and look at and kind of change the queries as we go. So that's basically it from our side of the problem. We're kind of excited to use out these tools in a way that is productive in this manner and to see how far we can push and kind of pulling out the full zoning codes from the documents.
So thank you so much, Sasha, for that explanation. And with that, we invite you to get involved in the National Zoning Atlas project. If you want to watch the Atlas grow, you can follow us on our various social media platforms, including Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. And well, with that, we'll open the Q&A for more questions. And I see that there are some questions that are coming in now. So Dave Warren asks, thanks for all your work on this important tool and project. Is there an output that we're imagining? Is one output that we're imagining a report that advocates for more uniform language for the meat and potatoes part of the kind of zoning ordinances to make tasks like this easier in the future, or a report aimed at states to require consistent language to make it easier? So this sounds like maybe a Sara question. Yeah.
Great. And I think we can all come on camera now. It sounds like maybe we can take our question slide off. Thanks, Diana. I mean, I think that there's a lot of directions that this project can go. So from a technical side, Dr. Rush has outlined why this project is unusual just from a machine learning perspective. From an, I guess, a regulatory and advocacy side, I think it's already clear based on the research that we've done so far that zoning codes are extremely complex, highly technical, and extremely difficult for humans or machines to read. Does that then make a case for simplification or for more formulaic type zoning codes where there's some kind of form that local governments can use to outline particular regulatory requirements in each district? Surely, if you're familiar with zoning, you know that there would be resistance to a single type of form or format for local governments to have. But if you consider the way that zoning was first adopted through model laws that states then adopted and then local governments then adopted, you might see a case to be made here for this research to result in perhaps a model format for zoning codes to, when they get revised by local governments, for those local governments to consider more standardized ways of documenting what their codes actually attempt to regulate. So I don't think we have that specifically in mind now to propose. But again, if you look at the origin story of zoning, it really started off as this model that actually then became uniformly adopted by all.
And I'll just tack on that actually that point calling for more standardized reporting, we did make that point in the conclusion of our brief that we wrote up on the pilot machine learning process that we did, just offering a couple of solutions that states and potentially the federal government could try requiring reporting standards or an oversight body or some kind of way of asking localities to report on what they have on the books in a more standard, easy to understand format. So yeah, we have put that call out there. It's just not, as Sarah said, like it, we haven't made, it's not like our central hill that we're working on.
Thanks, everyone. And on the question of state and federal partnerships, Sorli Titlau asks, what interest have we gotten from federal or state partners to coordinate data acquisition for the remaining states? And I think that also, and to kind of tack onto that, can you talk a little bit more about how state teams' efforts can kind of complement the machine learning efforts? Yeah. I think this is maybe like a Sara, Lydia, and Judah question.
I'll pitch it over to Lydia and Judah, actually, because you guys, we said a little bit about this as well in our report.
Sorry, could you repeat the question? I was just looking for it in the list of questions and answers and wasn't finding it.
Oh, it's the first question, which is that's in the open questions. So basically, kind of what kind of federal or state partnerships have we pursued to coordinate the remaining kind of data acquisition, but also in general, how can the kind of existing state atlas teams that are currently kind of digitizing the zoning code and atlas, how can those efforts kind of complement our machine learning efforts as well?
Yeah, and I'm happy to take this one, Lydia.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that this one really is your wheelhouse, Sarah, because it's the state teams.
Yeah, I mean, so we talked a little bit about the data that's out there at the federal level. We've worked a little bit, and we've at least talked with the research and data folks at HUD and trying to understand how they're going to be ramping up efforts, especially in light of the recent executive order from the White House that ties or potentially ties funding to zoning reform efforts. So I would just say there's not a lot of federal data out there, and so the state teams don't really have much to work on in that regard. But again, you know, to the point that was just raised about data collection and reporting, if there are ways that the federal government can kind of start with that, if one of the ways that they will realize the aims of that executive order is through better reporting, and we hope to influence that, but there's not a lot to draw from right now.
Great, thanks. I'm going to, an anonymous attendee asks, do we have a timeline over which that we're completing the initial atlas, or kind of what can we say about our current progress? And then I'm also going to tack on a question, which is kind of what are the kind of, what is the timeline for our NLP efforts as well?
So I'll answer the first one just to say that we have 20 states at a variety of statuses. So some states have been completed, like Connecticut, Montana, soon to be Rhode Island and New Hampshire, and some other big states, California, that are substantially completed, although not yet fully posted with all of our regulatory characteristics. So, you know, states are moving forward. We are hoping, I mean, just with more funding for the centralized teams and more state teams getting involved and interested, we're hoping for more coverage. So it's really a matter at this point of manpower. But that's why if we have machine learning, either to read the zoning codes in the first place or to process updates, everything will get much faster. And so that's one of the reasons why we are investing heavily in terms of time in this project, and grateful for the partnerships with Urban and Dr. Rush's lab. So I'll turn it over to maybe to Sasha to comment on you know, what the timeline is for thinking about the steps in the machine learning process.
Yeah, I would say we're still kind of early stage on our side. We hope to move relatively quickly, but I think, yeah, what we're doing is trying to research different approaches to make progress here. We've been focusing on the Connecticut zoning codes for this semester, but hopefully we'll have some good results there and we can expand.
And Sasha, while I have you on, an anonymous attendee asks, do we have any ideas or strategies to tackle the non-standardization issue across the documents from a technical side? This can really wreak havoc during the OCR and text classification steps. Can you speak more to that?
Yeah, I think that we're accepting that as kind of a condition of this problem. So we're not trying to solve it. We're kind of assuming that that's going to be true. And I think we're kind of building that into our assumption that any approach that tries to really build a uniform model of how these documents work is maybe going to run into issues. And so we're kind of trying to be as agnostic to the form of the documents as we can.
Just to quickly piggyback on that, to give exhibit A of how a uniform approach can run into issues, I think one thing that we tried to do was kind of assume that zoning districts might be structured in a certain way such that, you search for divided into the following zoning districts, and that could then give you a list of where all the districts are neatly listed out so that they're really easy to extract from a zoning code. And this worked a lot of the time, but also there were plenty of zoning codes that were completely unstandardized and that this technique failed miserably at. So just can say that we've kind of been there. We've grappled with the unstandardized nature of all the documents, and definitely agree that kind of have to take it as a given and build it into any methodology, or you're going to run into exactly the same type of issues that we did during this process.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Alan Halter has another challenge of this process is, so do we have two separate machine learning models depending on the zoning style? So Euclidean versus form-based zoning, and are we addressing this in one model?
I'll just say before we talk about the model that the how-to guide assumes that we can collect that information across both traditional codes and form-based codes in a uniform manner. So we don't have a separate schema for collecting information about a form-based code than we would do for a traditional code, in part because there's a lot of form-based code provisions on height, on some of these other things that you see in traditional codes that are also prominent in form-based codes that kind of translate across. What we are doing with the form-based codes is we're making notes on those. So if it's a particular district that has a range of building types, for example, we're making a log of the building types, and that's something we can do in our data entry tool. So I'll turn it over to someone else to talk about the how machine learning differentiates that. If at all. Actually, I don't think we've gotten, other than the Hartford code in Connecticut, we don't have a code in the Connecticut data set that graphically displays, and even in the Hartford code, it doesn't exclusively graphically display the answers, how it's regulated. It's the information is included both graphically, but also in text and in tables. So I think even with codes with lots of graphics like the Hartford code, you still would probably have a way to extract the information from text. So it may not be something that Sasha's lab has considered yet, but Lydia.
Yeah, sorry. I'll just say that our assumption of the role of machine learning here is to try to not bake any assumptions into the process, but to take as much expert knowledge from people who know how to kind of go through in the way the people in this project have into the system. So our input is roughly the kind of equivalence classes or the descriptions of how to look for something that are kind of put together in like the how to make a zoning atlas guide, and try to encode that into a general tool. So if that makes sense, so nothing we're doing is built into our tool. It just comes through from the text of those guides.
Great. And Mark Sprates asks if we have any thoughts on blending in climate impact models to overlay on top of the current data that we're collecting. Does anybody want to kind of answer that?
So in terms of the zoning atlas itself, certainly the mapped results lend themselves to a variety of overlays, including climate risk. We are, for example, working on a project funded by Cornell's Atkinson Center on Sustainability with the Regional Plan Association, the tri-state nonprofit that covers New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut, on modeling the zoning atlas results, particularly where multifamily housing is located and areas where there's sea level rise risks and flooding risks. So using that, we hope to draw some lessons for the New York City metro region, and more on that project will be forthcoming, but that certainly, again, lends itself, the mapping end result lends itself to exactly that.
Great. And finally, Raphael Loud asks if we have an API. Sarah, do you want to talk about our possible API endpoint?
Sure. So, I mean, there's a huge volume of data that's been collected by the state teams, and we're working with all of the researchers and institutions across that spectrum. So it includes university researchers like myself and Dr. Xu and Dr. Rush. It includes institutional nonprofits like the Urban Institute, although the Urban Institute is a collaborator, but other nonprofits that work in planning and urban policy, individuals, planning agencies at the state and local levels, and so on. So there's a real range of folks who are contributing information. Because of that, it's somewhat of a complex scope as to what kind of data is releasable to the public across all of these different groups. And so we're working on trying to develop a unified policy for data management across all of these groups, and then hopefully more information about what that then implies for APIs, but also for this secondary research that we think that this data will unlock is forthcoming. So thank you for your patience on that.
And it looks like we have another question from Kyle Sorley-Titla. What does the update schedule of zoning codes look like? And then, so their localities change zoning codes. Is there a more systematic way to look for these changes in the zoning codes?
And I think Jude and Lydia, we mentioned this in that report briefly, to just say, you know, web scraping might be a tool that is perhaps an obvious one to deploy to these very diverse 30,000 local zoning codes and their websites, and to try to make that process of catching an update more automated, and then feed it into yet another algorithm that then reads what it says and inputs it into our tool. I should say, actually, also relevant to the last question, we do now have a mechanism for individual planners and others who are knowledgeable about zoning codes in their area to develop their own account and to update their own codes. So be in touch with us through any of the means that were shown on the slide, or through zoningatlas@cornell.edu if you are interested in spearheading in your region, or even updating for your town. If you do a major update, certainly you know, your zoning code, because we will need that kind of decentralized support until we get these more automated tools up and running.
Great. And Brendan mentions zoninghub.com, and Dave Warren says, thank you all, and glad that we are beginning these efforts to standardize the zoning code digitization process. So with that, we'll end it here. Thanks everyone for attending our seminar, and looking forward to connecting with all of you. All right.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.